Some women returned to be forgiven. Evelyn Harper returned to make an entire ballroom remember what it had done. The Ashford Ballroom had been built for spectacle, for glittering chandeliers, polished marble, and the soft thunder of 100 silk skirts turning beneath candlelight. Yet at 12 strokes past midnight, all its beauty seemed to hold its breath. The orchestra had been drawing the final notes of a waltz when the great clock above the eastern balcony began to toll. 1, 2, 3. Each sound rolled through the room like a warning. By the 8th stroke, conversations softened. By the 10th, several heads turned toward the entrance for no reason they could name. By the 12th, the footman at the door lifted his chin, unfolded a card with gloved hands, and announced in a voice that carried to every gilded corner, "Miss Evelyn Harper." The name fell harder than glass. For 1 year, London had spoken it only in whispers, usually with pity, sometimes with delight, always with the cruel satisfaction society reserved for a woman who had almost been loved by a duke and then publicly forgotten. Yet the woman who stepped into the light did not look forgotten. She wore a gown of pale silver that caught the candle flames like winter moonlight over snow. Her shoulders were straight. Her chin was calm. Her dark blonde hair had been swept into a simple arrangement, without flowers, without feathers, without any plea for admiration. Around her throat rested a black sapphire on a thin chain, so dark it seemed to hold the midnight inside it. No one applauded. No one greeted her. The ballroom merely stared. Lady Ashford's fan froze halfway open. Lord Pembroke stopped with his wineglass near his mouth. A pair of young women near the columns leaned close together, but even they forgot to whisper. Evelyn Harper took 3 steps forward, and the hem of her gown whispered across the marble as if the room itself were afraid to touch her. She had not returned as a wounded girl. She had returned as a question no one wanted answered. At the far end of the ballroom, beneath a portrait of some long-dead Ashford ancestor, Duke Adrian Blackwood stood beside Lady Cassandra Vale, dressed in black evening clothes and the kind of stillness people mistook for control. He had heard the name. Of course he had. It struck him before he saw her, opening a place in his chest he had spent a year sealing shut. Then the crowd shifted. Candlelight moved, and he saw Evelyn. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. The wine trembled once, a small red shiver against crystal. No one else noticed. Evelyn did. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and whatever music remained inside the walls died completely. Adrian had imagined this moment in darker hours, though never honestly. In his thoughts, she had been angry, pale, perhaps still broken enough to make forgiveness possible. But this woman was not the girl he had left beneath the rain outside Blackwood House. This woman had survived him. Worse, she had learned to stand beautifully in the ruins. His gaze dropped to the sapphire at her throat, and the blood seemed to leave his face. That jewel had belonged to his mother. It had vanished the night she died. It should have been locked in memory, buried with scandal, sealed beneath the Blackwood name forever. Yet there it rested against Evelyn Harper's skin, bright with accusation and cold with truth. Lady Cassandra touched his sleeve. "Adrian." He did not answer. He could not. Across the room, Evelyn inclined her head with perfect courtesy, not to him alone, but to the entire society that had once watched her humiliation and called it entertainment. Then she smiled. It was not warm. It was not cruel. It was worse. It was peaceful. And in that peace, Adrian Blackwood understood that she had not come back to beg, not to weep, not to reclaim the heart he had broken. She had come back knowing something. Something about his house. Something about his mother. Something that could turn the midnight ballroom into a courtroom before dawn. 1 year earlier, Evelyn Harper had stood beneath the same chandeliers with hope folded carefully inside her chest, fragile as a letter sealed but not yet sent. The Ashford Ballroom had looked warmer then. The candles had seemed kinder. The music had carried the bright, foolish promise of a future she had almost allowed herself to believe in. Everyone in London knew Duke Adrian Blackwood had danced with her twice that evening, and everyone knew what twice meant when a duke with 40,000 acres, 3 townhouses, and a name older than the country itself chose to break custom before the watching eyes of society. Evelyn had worn pale blue then, not silver, with a ribbon at her waist and her mother's pearls at her throat. She had been 23, proud enough to stand straight, tender enough to tremble when Adrian's hand settled lightly at her back during the waltz. He had looked at her as though the rest of the room had dissolved. After supper, he had murmured, low enough that only she could hear, "Meet me by the conservatory doors. There is something I must ask you." She had not smiled too much. A lady never smiled too much. But joy had moved through her like sunlight through glass. For the next hour, every sound seemed sharpened by expectation. The scrape of chairs, the clink of silver, the rustle of satin, the quickened beat of her own heart. She did not know that, behind the closed door of Lord Ashford's private study, Victor Blackwood was placing a packet of papers into Adrian's hand. She did not know that the documents bore her father's name beside accusations written in a stranger's careful ink. She did not know that Victor spoke softly of scandal, disgrace, and a buried connection to the death of the old Duchess of Blackwood. She only knew that when Adrian returned, something human had vanished from his face. He found her near the conservatory, where orange trees breathed their sweet green scent into the winter air. "Your Grace," she whispered, still smiling. He flinched at the title as though it had struck him. For a moment, he looked at her with such pain that she almost reached for him. Then his expression hardened. "Miss Harper, I owe you an apology." Her smile faded slowly. "An apology? I have allowed society to misunderstand my intentions." The words were precise, lifeless, chosen like stones laid over a grave. Evelyn stared at him, unable to make sense of them. "I do not understand. There will be no proposal." Beyond the glass, rain traced silver lines down the dark panes. Inside, the warmth became unbearable. Evelyn heard herself breathe once. Only once. "Was I mistaken then?" she asked. "Did I imagine your kindness?" His jaw tightened, but his eyes did not soften. "You imagined its meaning." That was the moment something broke, though it made no sound. Not in her hands. Not in the room. Only somewhere deep inside, where a young woman had kept her last belief in being chosen honestly. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to demand the truth. But behind them, the ballroom doors had opened. Two ladies paused. A gentleman turned his head. The story was already beginning to form in their eyes. Evelyn understood with terrible clarity that if she pleaded, London would remember the pleading longer than the wound. So she lowered her chin, gave the smallest curtsy of her life, and said, "Then I thank you for correcting my imagination, Your Grace." She walked away without running. That was the only victory left to her. By morning, the whispers had spread from Mayfair to every breakfast table worth being invited to. Poor Miss Harper. Ambitious Miss Harper. Abandoned Miss Harper. Her father told her they would leave for Boston within the week. Her mother wept quietly into handkerchiefs edged with lace. Evelyn packed her trunks herself. On the final evening before her departure, rain fell again over London, steady and cold. Outside Blackwood House, where she had gone only to return a book Adrian had once lent her, she found the front steps empty and the door unanswered. A carriage stood in the drive. A servant hurried past carrying a small locked box, but in his haste, something slipped from beneath the lid and fluttered onto the wet stone. Evelyn picked it up before the rain could take it. It was only a torn piece of paper, blackened at one edge as if rescued from a fire. Most of the words were gone, but one line remained clear enough to read. "Victor must never inherit what I have hidden." Beneath it was a signature she did not recognize then, elegant and fading. Helena Blackwood, Adrian's mother. Boston taught Evelyn Harper the discipline of surviving without asking the world to be gentle. Her aunt's house stood on a quiet street where winter winds came off the harbor with a salt-sharp bite, rattling the window panes and slipping beneath doors no matter how tightly they were shut. It was smaller than the London home she had known, built of red brick instead of pale stone, with narrow stairs, plain rugs, and a parlor that smelled of beeswax, old books, and strong tea. To society, she had been sent away in shame. To her Aunt Margaret, she had arrived like a letter burned at the edges, but still readable. "You may cry here," her aunt had said on the first night, setting a lamp beside the bed. Evelyn had looked down at her folded hands. "I would rather learn accounts." So she did. While London imagined her wasting away beside a window, Evelyn learned ledgers, property law, shipping contracts, and the cold grammar of money. Her aunt, widowed for 12 years and far wiser than most men who underestimated her, placed invoices before Evelyn each morning and corrected her with merciless patience. "A woman who understands documents," Margaret said, tapping the page with one thin finger, is harder to bury beneath lies. The torn scrap from Blackwood House remained hidden in Evelyn's writing desk, wrapped in a square of linen. At first, she told herself she kept it only because it had fallen at her feet on the night her life changed. Then, as weeks became months, the words began to trouble her. Victor must never inherit what I have hidden. Helena Blackwood. The old Duchess had died years before under circumstances London called tragic and vague, which usually meant important people had agreed not to ask useful questions. Evelyn began quietly. A letter to a retired solicitor in New York who had once handled English estates. A payment to a clerk who could search shipping records. A cautious inquiry about the Blackwood family trust. Piece by piece, the silence around Helena Blackwood started to crack. There had been a second will. There had been a locked blue ledger. There had been a missing sapphire necklace, removed from the Duchess's rooms before the household inventory was sealed. And always, somewhere near the edge of every answer, was Victor Blackwood. Evelyn did not know whether Adrian had been deceived or whether he had chosen cowardice with open eyes. That uncertainty hurt more than hatred would have. Hatred was clean. This was not. Some nights, when snow covered the Boston streets and carriage wheels whispered past like ghosts, she would remember Adrian's face outside the conservatory. Not cruel, not truly. Ruined. As though he had been cutting out his own heart and calling it duty. Then she would remember his words. You imagined its meaning. And whatever softness remained in her would turn still again. By spring, Evelyn no longer lowered her eyes when strangers asked about England. By summer, she could hear a waltz without leaving the room. By autumn, she had become useful to her aunt's business affairs, so calm with figures and correspondence that men twice her age forgot to patronize her after the first meeting. The girl London had pitied was disappearing, not because she had died, but because she had learned how little pity was worth. Then, on a gray November morning, a packet arrived without a return address. Inside was an invitation to Lady Ashford's winter ball in London, printed on thick ivory card. Beneath it lay a narrow black ribbon and a note written in a hand Evelyn did not know. Where what was stolen, and come at midnight. A friend who knows who truly silenced the Duchess. Evelyn read the line once. Then again. Her heartbeat remained steady, which surprised her. Perhaps grief had trained it well. At the bottom of the packet, wrapped in cotton, rested the black sapphire necklace. It was colder than the room when she lifted it into her palm. Dark, beautiful, accusing. Aunt Margaret found her there by the desk, the invitation open, the jewel catching the weak morning light. Will you go? She asked. Evelyn closed her fingers around the sapphire, feeling its edges press into her skin. London had watched her leave as though she were a ruined chapter. It would watch her return as something else. Yes, she said quietly. But not for him. Adrian Blackwood had not believed in ghosts until Evelyn Harper stepped back into the Ashford ballroom, wearing his mother's sapphire. For one terrible moment, the candles, the music, Lady Cassandra's hand upon his sleeve, and the 100 curious faces around him all seemed to recede, leaving only the jewel at Evelyn's throat and the memory it carried. His mother had worn that sapphire on the last winter evening he remembered clearly from childhood, when Blackwood Hall had smelled of pine, candle wax, and rain-soaked wool, and Helena Blackwood had bent to fasten his collar before supper. Never trust a man who needs darkness to keep his fortune, she had whispered, pressing a kiss to his brow. He had been too young to understand. Years later, after her death, the necklace had vanished, and his father had forbidden anyone to speak of it again. Now it rested against the woman Adrian had destroyed, and the past rose before him like a door opening in a sealed room. Adrian, Lady Cassandra said again, her voice softer but edged with irritation. Everyone is staring. He forced air into his lungs. Let them. The words escaped before caution could stop them. Cassandra's fingers tightened on his sleeve. She was beautiful in the way society rewarded. All pale gold hair, perfect posture, and diamonds arranged like frost across her throat. Their understanding was not yet an engagement, but London had already begun treating it as one, and Cassandra's family had made it clear that her fortune, influence, and spotless reputation would steady the Blackwood title after a year of rumors. Adrian had told himself he could endure such a marriage. He had endured worse things than an empty future. Then Evelyn had walked in. Across the ballroom, she accepted Lady Ashford's greeting with calm grace. as though she had not been the subject of every cruel whisper in the room. Lord Caleb Winslow stood near the entrance, tall, composed, and unmistakably American in his ease, with the confidence of a man who had crossed oceans and acquired neither fear of dukes nor reverence for old titles. He offered Evelyn his arm. She took it. Adrian felt the simple gesture like a hand closing around his throat. He had no right to feel anything. That was the most bitter part. He had given up every right the night he chose silence over trust. Victor Blackwood appeared beside him almost soundlessly, smelling faintly of tobacco and expensive soap. "Unexpected, is it not?" Victor murmured, his smile never touching his eyes. "Miss Harper has improved during exile." Adrian did not look at him. "Do not speak of her. Still protective? How touching. Though protection looks rather like abandonment when observed from the outside." Adrian's jaw tightened. Victor had always known where to place the blade without appearing to lift his hand. "What do you know about the sapphire?" Adrian asked. For the first time, a pause disturbed Victor's smoothness. "Only a breath. Only enough. I know it was lost years ago. Lost things have a habit of being found. So do dangerous rumors." Victor's voice lowered. "Be careful tonight, cousin. The Blackwood name has survived worse than a disappointed young woman." Adrian turned then, slowly. "She was never merely that." Victor's smile thinned, but before he could reply, Lady Cassandra drew Adrian's attention with a brittle laugh. "Lord Winslow seems quite devoted to Miss Harper. I heard he traveled from Boston with her." The words were meant to wound politely. They succeeded. Adrian watched as Caleb leaned close to say something that made Evelyn's expression soften, not into warmth exactly, but into trust. Trust. The one thing Adrian had denied her. Across the room, Evelyn looked up as if she had felt his gaze. Their eyes met again, and this time she did not look away. She placed one gloved hand lightly on Caleb's sleeve and spoke without moving her lips enough for anyone else to read. But Adrian saw the shape of it. "Not yet." Caleb inclined his head. Then, as he guided her toward the refreshment table, he said quietly, just loud enough for Adrian to hear when they passed, "Tonight, we make him confess." The room did not change. The chandeliers still burned. The violins began again with trembling obedience. Yet Adrian felt the floor shift beneath him. Evelyn had not returned alone. She had returned with a plan, with a witness, with his mother's sapphire, and perhaps with the one truth he had spent a year refusing to face, that the woman he thought he had sacrificed for honor might be the only person in the room brave enough to save it. The first note of the next waltz rose uncertainly, as though even the orchestra had begun to understand that the room was no longer simply a ballroom, but a place where old sins had dressed themselves in silk and candlelight. Evelyn stood beside the refreshment table with Lord Caleb Winslow at her shoulder, a crystal glass of lemonade untouched in her gloved hand. Around her, society pretended not to stare and failed beautifully. Fans moved too slowly. Conversations tilted toward her and then away. Every whispered sentence seemed to carry her name without daring to hold it fully. Then Adrian crossed the floor. He did not hurry. Dukes never hurried unless the world was ending, and perhaps his was. Lady Cassandra's face sharpened as he left her. Victor watched with his pale, satisfied smile. Evelyn felt Adrian approach before she turned, the way one feels thunder moving through a closed house. Caleb's hand remained steady near her elbow, not possessive, not claiming, merely present. It was exactly why she trusted him. He understood that tonight she needed an ally, not a rescuer. Adrian stopped before her and bowed. The movement was perfect. The silence it created was not. "Miss Harper," he said. "Your Grace." Her voice was calm enough to make several women nearby exchange glances. He looked at Caleb, then back at her. "May I have this dance?" Caleb's expression did not change, but Evelyn heard the faintest warning in his breath. This was not part of their timing. Not yet. But if she refused, London would feast on it. If she accepted, Adrian would have 3 minutes close enough to wound her again. Evelyn placed her glass on the table. "One dance," she said. "No more than the music allows." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or admiration. He offered his hand. She laid hers upon it with the careful poise of a woman touching a closed door she had once mistaken for home. The ballroom parted for them. That was the first cruelty of society. It always made room for suffering when suffering promised entertainment. Adrian led her to the center of the floor, and the waltz gathered around them in slow, polished circles. His hand settled at a proper distance. Hers rested lightly on his shoulder. They had stood closer once in dreams than they did now in public. "You came back changed," he said. "No," Evelyn answered. "I came back awake." His breath caught, so softly that only she could hear it. "The sapphire. You recognize it. It belonged to my mother. Then perhaps you should ask why it was sent to me." They turned beneath the chandeliers, candlelight sliding over her silver gown, over his black sleeve, over the space between them that no music could soften. Adrian's gaze searched her face as though he might find the girl he had abandoned hidden beneath this new composure. Evelyn let him look. She wanted him to understand that grief had not made her smaller. It had carved away everything unnecessary. "Who gave it to you?" he asked. "Someone who believes the dead have been patient long enough." His hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her back. "Evelyn." The sound of her name in his voice was a dangerous thing. It remembered too much. It remembered rain against glass, orange blossoms in a conservatory, a promise that had never been spoken aloud but had lived between them anyway. She lifted her eyes to his. "You lost the right to say my name with sorrow." He looked as if she had struck him, though she had not raised her voice. "I thought I was protecting you." "From what?" The words came softly. "The truth, or the inconvenience of trusting me with it." Around them, other couples continued their turns, but their attention had sharpened. Evelyn could feel the room listening with its skin. Adrian swallowed. The Duke of Blackwood, who had faced Parliament, creditors, rivals, and scandal without visible strain, stood undone by one woman's quiet question. "There were documents," he said. "Victor showed me enough to believe your father had been connected to my mother's disgrace. And you believed him. I was grieving a woman I never fully understood. So you punished one who loved you." The sentence passed between them like a candle being blown out. Adrian closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, the mask was cracked. Not gone. Cracked. Evelyn drew her hand from his shoulder just long enough to slip a folded scrap of paper from the small silver reticule at her wrist. As the waltz turned them near the shadow of a marble column, she pressed it into his palm. "Read it when your courage becomes stronger than your pride." His fingers closed around the paper. "What is this?" "A piece of the truth you chose not to seek." The music neared its final phrase. Adrian looked down, and though he could not unfold the scrap without drawing attention, he saw the blackened edge, the old ink, and one unmistakable word visible through the fold. "Victor." The last note trembled through the ballroom. Evelyn stepped back and curtsied with flawless grace. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace." Then she left him standing beneath the chandeliers with his mother's name around her throat and his cousin's name burning in his hand. Adrian did not open the folded scrap at once. For several seconds after Evelyn left him, he remained beneath the chandeliers with his fingers closed around the paper as if it were something alive. The ballroom resumed its glittering habits around him, but every sound seemed distant now, muffled beneath the rush of blood in his ears. Laughter lifted and broke. Silk moved over marble. The orchestra began another piece with desperate politeness. Yet all Adrian could feel was the rough, blackened edge pressing through his glove and the single visible word that had turned his entire past into a question. "Victor." Across the room, Evelyn had returned to Caleb Winslow's side. She did not look back. That should have relieved him. Instead, it unsettled him more deeply. She no longer moved like a woman waiting to be followed. Caleb bent his head toward her, speaking softly, and Evelyn listened with the calm attention she had once given Adrian in gardens, galleries, and quiet corners where the rest of London had seemed too loud to matter. Adrian had no right to resent it. He resented it anyway. Lady Cassandra appeared at his side, her smile arranged for witnesses. "That was a generous gesture," she said. "Dancing with Miss Harper will certainly quiet some of the uglier gossip." "Will it?" Adrian asked. "Or feed better gossip?" Her blue eyes cooled. "You must be careful. Sentiment has ruined greater men than you." He finally looked at her. "I am beginning to think caution has done worse." Cassandra's expression tightened, but before she could answer, a ripple of attention passed through the room. Lord Ashford, flushed with wine and importance, had announced a brief supper interval. Guests began drifting toward the adjoining gallery, where long tables had been arranged beneath garlands of winter greenery. Evelyn moved with Caleb toward the shadowed archway at the far end, not toward supper, but toward the small side corridor leading to the blue salon. Adrian followed at a distance before he could decide not to. He stopped just beyond the half-open door, where the voices inside reached him clearly. "You did well," Caleb said. His American accent made the words sound less polished and more honest. He took the paper. Taking it is not the same as believing it. Evelyn's voice was steady, but softer now that the ballroom could not hear. Adrian believes pain more easily than truth. Caleb paused. "And you? Do you believe he deserves the truth?" "Deserving has very little to do with tonight." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. There it was again, that blade she carried without lifting her hand. Caleb lowered his voice. "If this becomes too much, I can still claim our engagement before the room. It would protect you from speculation." "No," Evelyn answered quickly, then gentled. "You have already given me more than I had any right to ask. I will not let London turn your kindness into a cage. It would not be a cage if you chose it." Silence followed. Adrian felt the words land somewhere he could not defend. When Evelyn spoke again, there was sadness in it, but not uncertainty. "You are a good man, Caleb. That is precisely why I will not use you to survive a bad one." Adrian's hand tightened at his side. A bad one. He had earned that. Footsteps approached from the other end of the corridor, and he stepped back into the deeper shadow beside a marble statue. Lady Cassandra passed close enough that the diamonds at her throat flashed like ice. Victor walked beside her, his pleasant expression stripped away now that no audience watched. "You promised me she would be too ashamed to show her face in London again," Cassandra whispered. "And yet she wears the Duchess's sapphire as if it were a medal." "A temporary inconvenience," Victor said. "By morning, she will regret returning. She has proof. She has fragments." His tone sharpened. "Fragments can be made to look like desperation, especially when held by a woman with a wounded reputation." Cassandra stopped near the salon door. "And the Duke? Adrian has spent his life obeying guilt. He will hesitate. He always does." Adrian stood perfectly still in the shadow, the paper in his hand suddenly heavier than any weapon could have been. Cassandra's voice dropped to a whisper colder than the winter wind beyond the windows. "Once he marries me, the Harper girl will disappear again." Inside the salon, a floorboard gave the faintest sound. Evelyn had heard. Adrian knew it before he saw her appear at the doorway, her face pale but composed, the black sapphire resting at her throat like a witness that refused to die. Victor turned first, then Cassandra, then Adrian stepped from the shadows. For the first time that night, all four of them stood in the same narrow pool of candlelight, and no one had a graceful lie ready. The corridor held them in a silence too narrow for escape. Candlelight trembled along the blue wallpaper, touching Cassandra's diamonds, Victor's smooth face, Adrian's clenched hand, and Evelyn's steady eyes with equal indifference. For one breath, no one moved. Then Victor smiled, and the danger of him returned wearing courtesy. "Miss Harper," he said, "how unfortunate that you have wandered so far from the ballroom. Private corridors encourage private misunderstandings." Evelyn looked at him as though he were a stain on fine linen. "I have misunderstood nothing." Cassandra gave a delicate laugh. "My dear, grief can make women imaginative. So can embarrassment." Adrian's head turned sharply toward her. "Enough." The word was quiet, but it altered the air. Cassandra flushed, not with shame, but with anger at being corrected before an audience, however small. Victor's gaze slid to Adrian's hand. "Have you been collecting souvenirs from Miss Harper now? How sentimental." Adrian slowly unfolded the burned scrap Evelyn had given him. His eyes moved over the torn line, the scorched edge, the old ink. "Victor must never inherit what I have hidden." The handwriting struck him first, not because it was elegant, though it was, because he remembered it from childhood letters tucked into birthday books, from labels on cabinets in his mother's private sitting room, from a note once pinned to his coat when he was 8 years old and afraid of his first ride across the North Field. His mother's hand, his mother's warning, his mother, speaking from a piece of paper everyone had wanted turned to ash. "Where did you get this?" Adrian asked, his voice rough. Evelyn held his gaze. "From the steps of Blackwood House, the night I left London. A servant dropped it from a locked box. I thought it was meaningless then." "It is meaningless now," Victor said smoothly. "A half-burned scrap, conveniently produced by a woman desperate to restore her reputation." Evelyn reached into her reticule and drew out a folded packet sealed with plain black wax. Then perhaps the rest will be more useful. Victor's smile disappeared. Not all at once. That would have been too honest. It faded by degrees, leaving something pale and hard beneath. Cassandra saw it and stepped back half an inch. Caleb appeared at the far end of the corridor, drawn by the lengthening silence, and behind him came Lady Ashford with two curious matrons hovering close enough to become witnesses. The private moment had begun to open into a public one. Victor recovered first. He turned toward Lady Ashford with a look of weary nobility. I regret this unpleasantness. Miss Harper has returned from America with a collection of accusations against my family. I had hoped to spare her the embarrassment of exposing them before the room. How generous, Evelyn said. You always preferred others to suffer quietly. The words carried. More guests gathered at the corridor entrance, their supper plates abandoned, their faces bright with alarm and appetite. Victor lifted his voice with perfect sorrow. You see, this is precisely what I feared. A disappointed young woman, still wounded by my cousin's refusal, inventing a conspiracy to force her way back into consequence. The old whispers stirred. Evelyn felt them before she heard them. Poor Miss Harper. Ambitious Miss Harper. Abandoned Miss Harper. The second humiliation had arrived exactly as promised. But she was not the girl by the conservatory doors anymore. She stepped past Adrian into the wider candlelight and opened the packet. This is a copy of Helena Blackwood's final letter, witnessed by her companion and preserved by a solicitor in Boston. It states that Victor Blackwood had been moving estate funds into false accounts and intended to challenge Adrian's inheritance by destroying the trust records. A murmur passed through the guests. Victor laughed once. Absurd. There is more. Evelyn's fingers did not tremble. The sapphire was not stolen. Helena sent it away with instructions that it be returned only if the Blackwood heir was deceived by his own blood. Adrian looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time his grief had nowhere to hide. Victor's mask cracked. A touching performance. He reached into his coat and produced a folded legal notice embossed with a dark seal. But if we are discussing inheritance, let us be thorough. I possess documentation proving Adrian's claim is irregular. Until the matter is resolved, he has no lawful right to act as Duke of Blackwood. The ballroom beyond the corridor fell into a hush so deep it seemed to extinguish the candles. Adrian stood motionless. Cassandra pressed a hand to her throat. Lady Ashford whispered, Good heavens. Evelyn looked at the seal, then at Victor's triumphant face, and understood the final shape of his plan. He did not merely want to ruin her. He had come to take everything from Adrian too. For one suspended moment, no one in the Ashford ballroom seemed to breathe. Victor Blackwood stood with the false legal notice held delicately between two fingers, as if it were a calling card rather than a blade wrapped in paper. Around him, silk gowns stilled, gloved hands hovered over pearl necklaces, and men who had once praised Adrian's power now looked at him with the cautious curiosity reserved for a falling king. Adrian did not move. The document in Victor's hand should have enraged him. It should have sent him forward with the full force of a duke defending his name. Instead, he looked at Evelyn. Only Evelyn. She stood in the candlelight with his mother's sapphire at her throat and the proof in her hands, pale but unshaken, bearing before all of London the storm he had once chosen to face without her. And in that instant, Adrian understood the truest shame of his life. Not that Victor had deceived him, not that Cassandra had plotted beside him, not that society had believed the ugliest version of an innocent woman. His shame was quieter, colder. He had believed Evelyn too fragile for the truth, and by doing so, he had made her carry the lie alone. Victor's voice cut through the hush. I suggest we all proceed with dignity. Until the courts examine these documents, my cousin's claim must be treated as uncertain. No, Adrian said. The word was not loud, yet it traveled farther than Victor's speech. Victor blinked. I beg your pardon. Adrian stepped forward. You do not beg. You arrange. A murmur passed through the crowd. Lady Cassandra reached for his sleeve, but he moved beyond her touch. Adrian, do not make a spectacle. He looked at her then, and whatever she saw in his face made her hand fall away. The spectacle was made a year ago, he said, when I allowed Miss Harper to be humiliated because I lacked the courage to question a convenient lie. The ballroom changed around that sentence. Fans lowered. Backs straightened. Evelyn's breath caught, though her face remained still. Victor's jaw tightened. Careful, cousin. I have been careful for too long. Adrian turned to Lady Ashford. Send for Mr. Ellison. Lady Ashford, startled but eager to be useful at the center of history, nodded quickly to a footman. Mr. Ellison? Victor repeated. My mother's former solicitor, Adrian said. He arrived in London yesterday at my request after Miss Harper's return made me finally honest enough to seek what I should have sought a year ago. For the first time, Victor looked uncertain. It was brief, but everyone saw it. Within minutes that felt like hours, an elderly man with silver hair and a black evening coat entered from the front hall, still removing his gloves. Mr. Ellison carried a leather case worn at the corners. He bowed to Lady Ashford, then to Adrian. Then his gaze settled on the sapphire at Evelyn's throat, and his expression softened with recognition. Her Grace chose well, he said quietly. Victor's face hardened. This is absurd theater. Mr. Ellison opened the case and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing the same dark wax as Evelyn's packet. The late Duchess left instructions that this be delivered only if the black sapphire reappeared in public or if Lord Victor Blackwood attempted to interfere with the succession. A sound moved through the room, part gasp, part judgment. Adrian closed his eyes for one heartbeat. When he opened them, he no longer looked like a man trying to preserve power. He looked like a son finally hearing his mother from beyond silence. Mr. Ellison read only enough. There was no need for cruelty. The letter confirmed Victor's misdirection of funds, Cassandra's family connection to the false notice, and Helena Blackwood's fear that Adrian would be manipulated through guilt. With each sentence, Victor's elegance diminished. Cassandra stepped away from him as if distance could make innocence. It could not. When the reading ended, no one spoke. Adrian walked to Evelyn. Every eye followed him. She held herself with exquisite control, but he saw the cost beneath it, the year in America, the whispers, the nights she had spent becoming strong because he had not been brave. He stopped before her. Miss Harper, he said, and his voice broke softly over the formality. I owe you more than an apology can hold. Evelyn's eyes glistened, but no tear fell. Then do not make it small. He understood. Before the women who had pitied her, before the men who had doubted her, before Victor, Cassandra, Caleb, Lady Ashford, and the entire glittering court of London judgment, Duke Adrian Blackwood lowered himself to one knee. Not as a proposal, not as performance, as surrender. I broke your heart because I was too cowardly to trust it, he said. I let them call you abandoned when I was the one who failed. I let silence protect my pride and punish your innocence. If there is justice tonight, let it begin with every person in this room knowing that Evelyn Harper was never ruined. I was. The ballroom fell utterly still. Evelyn looked down at him. The most powerful man in the room humbled at her feet and did not rush to save him from the weight of what he had done. For once, London was allowed to see the wound from the correct side. The silence after Adrian's confession did not end at once. It loosened slowly, like frost beginning to give way beneath morning light. Evelyn stood before him while the ballroom watched, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel watched as prey. The eyes that had once followed her with pity now lowered in discomfort. The mouths that had shaped her name into gossip now stayed closed. Lady Ashford pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Lord Pembroke looked fixedly at the floor. Cassandra Vale stood rigid beside the marble column, her diamonds suddenly too bright, too cold, too useless. Victor Blackwood had retreated into stillness, his face emptied of charm as Mr. Ellison placed the sealed papers back into his case. No raised voice was needed to finish what truth had begun. A footman opened the doors to the front hall, and two officers who had been quietly summoned during the reading entered with the grave courtesy of men accustomed to unpleasant duties. Victor looked once at Adrian, then at Evelyn, and perhaps he understood that the room he had meant to command had become the room that would remember him differently forever. Cassandra did not follow him. She only turned her face away as if distance could erase alliance. It could not. When they were gone, the ballroom remained full, yet somehow emptier, all its glitter stripped of innocence. Adrian was still on one knee. Evelyn knew the kinder thing would be to offer her hand quickly, to let him rise, to let society breathe again. But kindness had too often been demanded from women as payment for their own pain. So she allowed the moment to exist, not to punish him, to honor the girl who had walked away from the conservatory 1 year before with her heart breaking quietly beneath a pale blue gown. At last, Evelyn spoke. "Stand, Your Grace." The title hurt him. She saw it. He accepted it. Adrian rose slowly, not as a duke restored, but as a man uncertain whether restoration was something he deserved. "I will not ask you for forgiveness tonight," he said. "Good," Evelyn answered. A faint tremor passed through the room. "Because I am too tired to give away pieces of myself simply to make others comfortable." Caleb, standing near the doorway, lowered his gaze with the smallest smile, not of amusement, but respect. He had done what he promised. He had stood beside her until she no longer needed anyone to stand between her and the world. Evelyn turned to him. "Thank you." Caleb bowed. "Always your friend, Miss Harper." There was no claim in it. No sorrow sharpened into possession. Only grace. Beyond the tall windows, the black of night had begun to soften into gray. Dawn was approaching London, quiet and cold. Evelyn removed the black sapphire from her throat. For a moment, Adrian's expression changed, but he did not reach for it. She placed it in his palm. "This belongs to your mother's truth," she said. "Not to my wound." He looked down at the jewel, then back at her. "And what belongs to you?" Evelyn drew a breath. The ballroom, the whispers, the year in Boston, the rain outside Blackwood House, the girl she had been and the woman she had become, all moved through her and settled into something clear. "My name," she said. "My peace. My choice." Adrian closed his fingers around the sapphire. "Then I will spend whatever life remains to me respecting all three, whether I am allowed near them or not." That was the first answer he had given her that did not try to bind her. It reached her more deeply than any vow could have. Evelyn turned and walked toward the terrace doors. No one stopped her. Adrian followed only after several careful steps, leaving space enough for refusal. Outside, the cold struck them cleanly. The terrace stones were damp from the night mist, and the garden below lay silver beneath the first light. London was waking beyond the iron gates, unaware that a small court of judgment had ended before breakfast. Evelyn rested one gloved hand on the stone railing. "I did not return to be loved by you," she said. Adrian stood beside her, not touching. "I know. I returned to be free of what you made me." His voice was low. "Are you?" She looked toward the pale line of dawn. For a long moment, she listened to the city, to the fading music behind the glass, to her own heart beating steadily where it had once broken. "Almost," she whispered. Adrian accepted the word as if it were more mercy than he deserved. He did not ask for a promise. He did not ask for her hand. He simply stood with her while the morning found them. After a while, Evelyn looked at him. The pain was still there. So was the love. But now, for the first time, neither was stronger than her freedom. She held out her hand. Adrian stared at it, breath caught, then placed his hand beneath hers with a care that felt like reverence. Together, they watched the first sunlight touch the windows of the ballroom where everything had ended and something unnamed had begun. Some hearts do not return to the place they were broken. They return to prove they were never truly destroyed.